Welcome viewers. For this video I wanted to expand on some specific topics within Borderlands the pre-sequel and also share something that is pretty exciting to see that you don't really see people talking about that much. Athena is classified as a gladiator class, and in a certain respect she fits that description very well. If you are coming with some background of Borderlands 2, she fits somewhere between Sal and Krieg, with some elements of the Hellborn Krieg builds and the brawly nature of Sal. Like Krieg, she needs some time to spool up, and like Sal, she likes to be up close. Like both of them, they are endgame characters who, for the most part, need lots of skill points to be effective, rely on specific items of kit, weapons, and such to reach peak effectiveness. Unlike Jack or Wilhelm that can make do with just about anything and are not too picky about their items, Athena relies on good defensive action skill, decent tank skills, and skillful play to last long enough to spool up to staggering amounts of damage output. This means that she is most effective against big bosses with smaller fire round that she can use for kill skill boosts, specifically Unrelenting. In mobbing, she's rather average, or above average, but not anything particularly spectacular or remarkable compared to other characters like Melee Krieg, Maya with her legendary Catcom and appropriate relic, or Sal in Borderlands 2, which all can be great fun while mobbing. I don't mean to say that she is bad at it, but all the stuff that you hear about Maelstrom being super awesome and this build and that grenade and whatnot is a little distorted. I will review what Maelstrom is quickly. It's a skill on this right tree here, which means that when you shoot an enemy with a fire or shock weapon, grants you a stack of Maelstrom, which increases elemental damage. This whole tree here is half the point of our character and playstyle, and with that there are certain weapons and setups that work better than others. Certain guns like this Fast Talker and Company Man are a huge deal for her because of their fast fire rate, fast reload speed, huge magazine sizes, but as part of that you can't really legitimately get them anymore because of the way the Steam system works, so you have to use Gibbed, but they are very much worth it for her. Other things like grenades and slams can also build Maelstrom stacks as well, but for the most part, grenades and guns form the majority of what she does with Maelstrom. While I'm here, I'll quickly review the build that I use along with this kit. I won't spend too much time on it, as this isn't really a build video. The left tree here is rather ordinary. I kind of like United Front for the additional tank, as if you panic activate the Aspis when your shields are down, it's nice to get your shield back up quickly, as I don't find Conduit alone to be sufficient. Middle tree is pretty ordinary. I do have 1 point into Clarity of Purpose because her Celestial Calm boosts it. Why not? And the right tree here is also middle of the road. Pretty ordinary. Conduit is pretty good, but the way that it works is every time you trigger a shocked elemental effect on an enemy, the conduit effect lasts for about 2 seconds and then it expires. So you have to start up another dot on a different enemy to get it to trigger again, or wait for that original dot to expire and then start it again. So it's a really good skill, but I don't find myself relying on it alone. Overload and Flash Freeze along with Superconductor are pretty much up to you and how you decide to use them. Overload is really good for mobbing, as the chain effect allows you to keep Maelstrom stacks up when you're mobbing to fight the natural decay of Maelstrom. Flash Freeze is pretty good. That's more of a preference thing, and you can definitely do some really cool things with it if you know what you're doing. Superconductor I find is rather marginal. It really only works in really close quarters and isn't really that effective. And then Hades Shackle is just marginal at best. It only really works if you use it with something like Epicenter, and even then it has a 15-second cooldown, so it's really not that effective. Since I did mention Conduit, I'll review how it works very quickly here. This test dummy will make an excellent target. If you watch, I keep shooting this target continuously, You trigger Conduit the first time, but even though he still has a shock dock on him continuously this whole time, it doesn't actually keep Conduit active. It only works when you trigger it for the first 2 seconds, and then after that, it doesn't always engage it. So the easiest way to do this is if you want to keep something actively up with Conduit, is to shoot a different enemy, like this. When you trigger on a different enemy, you can get it to trigger again repeatedly. So obviously the Stormfront makes the best choice for this because it triggers both of them continuously. So if you watch, even though successive Stormfronts are still building up stacks of Maelstrom, Conduit isn't necessarily working. So the only way you get this to work is if you shoot something else. So this is why I like United Front, just because there's a bit of a gap there where Maelstrom induced Conduit shield boosting doesn't always work all the time. I think there's a good reason for that. It's a balance thing. But it's something for you to be aware of. It's not something you want to rely on, but it's a very good boost when it does work. You see I have shock dots going continuously on this particular target, and Conduit is not triggering. So I keep it triggered like that, shoot something else. See if we can get it to work. So that's Conduit right there. You got a dot on that one. Shoot somebody else, trigger on that one. Now it triggers again. So hopefully that kind of makes sense there. Now I'm going to quickly go over the weapons I use with this particular build. It's pretty straightforward. Most of the same stuff that other people use. This first slot, I like to use a cryo taser. It's a good weapon for just general freezing when you need to get control of a situation, or sometimes second winds. The next one I like to use is a fast talker. This weapon is just the best submachine gun on the market for her. It's just unfortunate you can't legitimately get it anymore, but it is a very exceptional submachine gun, and it performs a lot of other weapons for building stacks with her, such as the meat grinder, or the torrent, or the IVF, or other options like that. The company man is kind of equivalent to that. These both have very high magazine sizes, so they allow her to build stacks a lot easier, as reloading cycles tend to interrupt her Maelstrom building process. The next one is a Thunderfire. I don't use it that much. It tends to work best in atmosphere, and tends to have a really slow fire rate, so it's not really that good, but it does work. It tends to work better with fire-based builds, using stuff like Hellfires, just kind of swapping back and forth between this and that, but it's really up to you. I think it's a bit overrated. For other weapons, I use this Zero Beam for additional freezing options. This splitter is a backup weapon in case I run out of ammunition. Same with this Blood-Off Assault Rifle and the Hail for that matter. The practical development is also another big part of her build, many of her builds. The problem with it is that it has huge ammo consumption, so it's more of a closing weapon you use on really big bosses where you have excess of 600, 700 stacks of Maelstrom, where the huge ammo consumption is not really a factor. So a lot of people like to point out the weapon itself, but they don't really clarify how you should use it or what you should use it for. If you use it for mobbing, it's not going to work very well at all. You're better off with the company man for that. It's a lot more ammo efficient. The low-level Bada Boom and the Moonscaper I use for rocket jumping. For shields, I generally just use a generic turtle shield. The Kala I use for rocket jumping and also for fighting deadlift, as his shock damage recharges the shield, so his damage is effectively irrelevant. Grenades, I pretty much just only use a Stormfront. A Quasar works as well. It's really up to you and how you prefer to use them. For the Ozkits, Tranquility is my standard. The Eddy I use for backup reasons, but it's not a primary choice. I haven't used this one on her in a long time. The Ak I use for RK5 and EOS, and the Acrobat for rocket jumping. Last, for class mods, I pretty much only use these two class mods. The Celestial Gladiator is just great for mobbing and general purpose work. You can't go wrong with this class mod, it's really solid on her. And then the Surging Storm for big bosses like the raid boss version of Sentinel and EOS. Other than that, you don't really want to use one of these class mods all the time, just because the utility of the Celestial is really hard to ignore. When mobbing, like as you see here, you typically pull around 200-250 stacks of Maelstrom. Certain other builds, like ones that rely on boosting overload or use different weapons like the Hellfire, can get a bit higher, because the fire dots last longer than shock ones do, but they only work in atmosphere, which about half the game is in vacuum. So the stuff that I use here isn't the last word when it comes to Athena, and there's definitely other ways to use and build her, but I don't think she has much versatility and options like Cell does. That said, she does have a relatively high skill ceiling. You do have to manage a lot of different elements with her. She's not like Maya, who can, for the most part, clean up shop relatively easily. Athena has some elements of Zero's gameplay where you have to get good at timing, positioning, setup, and finally solid execution. Unfortunately, because the pre-sequel has a terrible endgame, even compared to Borderlands 1, there's not much for her to do besides big bosses and wandering around, which is a little bit of a letdown. She definitely has a lot of places where she would do very well if there was more content suitable for her. One thing I did want to go over specifically, which was half the point of this video, was what it would be like to have a huge amount of Maelstrom stacks with different guns. For this, we will be playing around in EOS's Stomping Ground, which is generally the best area to experiment, as there are smaller, but slightly deadly, fry around to fuel her kill skills. I should point out that she does not always approve of co-op play as much, because if the others are feasting on smaller fry, she may not get the kill skill bonus of Unrelenting, which is a huge part of her top tier performance. One time I was with some random, fighting the raid boss version of the Sentinel, which by itself is not too big of a deal aside from the bullet deflection phase of the Sentinel. Well, the problem came about in that there was no low tier guardians for me to trigger Unrelenting, so her power output was dismal. But let's take a look at some of the variety of different guns and see how they perform with a huge amount of Maelstrom stacks combined with the fire rate bonus of Unrelenting. Those Cell advocates among us have to admit that this level of fire rate, damage, and practically zero ammo consumption is something that is pretty nice to see. As part of this exhibit series, I feel that it is my duty to state that the Purging Anarchist, the Fast Talker, Company Man, Practical Development, Flacker, Flayer, Moonscaper, Boss Nova, Brigand, and Jack's hologram class mods are not exactly legitimate items. Besides these Hyperion shotguns, let's have a look at some other weapons, starting with pistols. Well, I think that covers most of the interesting pistols. Let's move on to some other platforms. Jacob's weapons, of course, don't work very well for this kind of stuff, and other weapons like the meat grinder, the fusillade, the fatale, stuff like that, will either be relatively uninteresting or pretty much the same as the others in some capacity. So obviously I can't sample everything, but let's have a look at some other examples. This short segment kind of highlights the Thunderfire's mediocrity in terms of damage, but also building and maintaining stacks of Maelstrom. The Flare is an excellent general purpose weapon for a lot of different characters in the pre-sequel, but not as much with Athena. A very different weapon to look at is the Flacker. It has a bit of notoriety in Borderlands 2, but in the pre-sequel it's a very different story, and Fragtrap likes it the most. Athena can use it too, but it's a huge amount of work for 8 seconds of bliss. I hope it is apparent by now why Athena is so picky with the guns she uses for building stacks, maintaining stacks, and doing damage. Weapons like this rapid all painful just don't cut it for either of those criteria. Let's move on to sniper rifles, and then finally rocket launchers. Stay around for those are exciting. Neither of these groups are her forte, but for now, why not? As we saw, Jacob's weapons and dull burst fire weapons don't work all that well with Maelstrom. Other weapons like the laser discer are also sketchy because the chuck damage is a function of how much ammo remains in the weapon. With 700 plus stacks of Maelstrom, switching to another weapon does not consume ammo as long as stormwaving is active and the Maelstrom stacks remain above 700. This means that when you build up 999 stacks of Maelstrom and switch to laser discer, you're not consuming any ammunition, so you can't chuck it. Unless, of course, you fired the weapon once, and then built up stacks, then switch back to the laser discer for one chuck, which does a lot of damage, but only works once and requires a lot of work. So to wrap this up, Athena can be a fun character, but because of how much skill points she needs on the left tree plus the right tree make her very skill point intensive, much like the characters I mentioned in Borderlands 2, regulating her to an endgame character for sure. On top of that, her dependence on shotgun ammo often leaves her in bad spots, but she is a fairly capable character that can be fun to play once you have the suitable kit that fits your playstyle and environment. I really do hope that you all enjoyed this video as much as I was challenged by making it. Do check out the epilogues after this for some extra content. Take care and thanks for watching. Glitch weapons are another weapon tier added to the game with the Claptastic Voyage DLC, which is a pretty good DLC overall. Now, Jack does the best with glitch weapons because of how just compensation can boost magazine sizes, marginal benefit, which can reload all weapons merely by throwing a grenade, which he tends to get for nearly free with Jack's cash. Combined with absolute advantage, which works a bit like Sal's inconceivable skill, he can really break a lot of weapons, including stuff like the luck cannon, which normally has to reload with every shot. Wilhelm also likes glitch weapons because his overcharge skill can help feed thirsty weapon platforms. Athena, on the other hand, does not really get to make as much use of them in general mobbing because they don't integrate as well with Maelstrom and their effect lasts for a very short time with higher and higher rates of fire. But very rarely all the factors can line up. Theodore splitters, in my opinion, tend to have the best visual effects associated with glitch weapons. We will first look at the yellow loop glitch effect followed by the light blue amp effect on a shotgun. But how does the red overload and green multi-shot effects work with huge amount of Maelstrom stacks? You might ask.
That's fucking off. You don't even have to mod it or give it to get unlimited ammo.
These segments necessitated the use of low-level guns to allow the glitch effect to be captured without obliterating the target too quickly. The red overload effect pushes the player back. You can see the game registers me here as re-entering the arena. The next thing I want to talk about briefly is the melee Athena concept. It's an interesting idea, considering that she is the only melee capable character in the game. It befalls me to examine it. First we will look at some weapons, starting off with the basic cryo taser in the first slot, a fast toggle for general purpose use, can't really go wrong with having one, the bladed Phrygia, which is the main melee weapon to use with any melee Athena build. It tends to form the core of what she does, and without one it doesn't really work that well. The next thing to think about is the Excalibur, but I'm not really sold on it. I prefer to use it on Aurelia. For shields, I use the Reoriginator for health stacking. You can use other ones, but this is the one that I use. The grenade is up to you, but a Quasar is probably the best choice. The Invigoration Oskit provides additional healing, but works best in vacuum, leaving a big hole in atmosphere. For class mods, I recommend the Blade Master comp. Let's go over the skills. The left tree is rather ordinary. I do get Stalwart, not because I want to, but because of additional health. The middle tree is pretty straightforward, but the problem with this build and other ones like it is that your Maelstrom tree gets nuked pretty hard and does not work like the Krieg melee hybrid builds. So you'll definitely be limited in that capacity unless you have some way to compensate. A flare shotgun could be a useful weapon. I would recommend experimenting with weapons that Athena does not typically use. With that all out of the way, let's get to playing. The fun thing about melee Athena builds is the dash ability, which works somewhat similar to Sting Like a Bee from Brick out of Borderlands 1. Combine that with her Aspis shield and the cryo mechanics does allow for an interesting variation on a melee character in the franchise. I do encourage people to try it out and experiment with it. In my experience, it works fine for mobbing, but falls flat in front of bigger bosses like Corporal Bob, Self-Loathing and Despair, etc., and collapses in the face of bigger bosses like Deadlift. Because her Maelstrom tree takes a big hit means that these kinds of mini bosses, aerial targets, and distant targets can be a big problem. Unlike a melee hybrid Brick who can still do just fine with gunnery and the different variations of melee hybrid Krieg builds, melee Athena is often stuck in bad spots without that much of a fallback. That said, I do encourage anybody who is curious to look into it and experiment, possibly with some kind of melee hybrid build that sacrifices certain skills on the left tree which are not that important in the larger scope. I could also be just playing her badly with a bad build and equipment, so definitely use some of the suggestions I made earlier as a starting point and explore from there, with the bladed Phrygia being a definite must-have. About the Excalibur, she can use it, but because it doesn't work all that well with her shield up, It's probably something I would consider using on a different character. It does have a neat effect where it combines a singularity effect plus a cryonova with successive critical melee strikes. But definitely give it a try on her if you experiment with melee Athena builds, as it just might fit into your style. It's a fun toy to use, Wilhelm likes it as much as Aurelia does, and it's a neat tool for mobbing. The last video I would like to share with you folks is a sub 3 minute Eclipse and EOS kill. Some time ago I caught wind of a YouTube video titled Athena vs Eclipse and EOS in 3 minutes 30 seconds by iTagonist. A link to this video will be in the description. I thought I could do a bit better, and I'm hoping someone else will do better than me, as I made two mistakes. Not switching out for the AC fast enough and being pushed off the platform in the final phase of EOS. Still, I was able to recover and make out alright. The principal advantage I have is leveraging the two side turrets on Eclipse to trigger Unrelenting quicker, feeding off swarmers better, and the big factor is using the fact that the flak that the AC spawns around area targets highlights the model of EOS, even though it is invisible, and helps keep Maelstrom stacks up and high between his phases. Add in blasting his minions to keep Unrelenting active means I'm more than ready for him as soon as he spawns. If you look carefully at the 42 minute 55 second mark, you can see a luck cannon that dropped on the platform. Swarmers can also drop luck cannons.